Well, let's stay with that story about this extraordinary weather that the country is experiencing. We're joined now by Tom Burke, the chairman and founding director of the environmental think tank E3G. Tom, thanks very much indeed for joining us. There is this thing we're having to live with now, isn't there, where the weather is strange and people say, oh, it might be climate change, and other people say, no, it's just El Nino, it's something that happens in the south and the jet stream changes, and it might necessarily be this way next year. I mean, we're stuck again with that decision, aren't we?
Well, it's clearly climate change is playing a part. You have natural variability, and then what's driving, if you like, the base of that natural variability up is a change in climate. And it's not just in Britain, it's all over the world. We've had an extraordinary year, not just here. We had floods in the Atacama Desert, which is the driest part of the planet. We had the highest temperatures ever recorded in Antarctica. We have most extraordinary storms in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So it's a whole series of things which can't be simply explained by the natural variability of the weather.
But people who put forward the thesis of climate change, and then the discussion was had, and it has been being had for the last 20 years, always said, look, it's not just going to get warmer, the weather patterns are going to change. And yet climate change deniers still feel comfortable saying, look, this isn't the kind of evidence that I can change my mind about yet.
Well, that's true about the deniers, but some people still think the Earth is flat. There's nothing you can do about that. What I think is really important that's happening to people now is their own experience year on year is in fact endorsing what the science has been saying for some time. People, whether it's bird watchers noticing birds arriving earlier in the year, whether it's people taking care of their own gardens, and of course in a much more unpleasant way, whether it's floods like we've just seen here up in Cumbria, which you had a sort of 1 in 100-year event happening 3 times in the last decade. So I think the message is getting through as experience, not just as the facts.
Now, meteorologists can explain the situation we're in at the moment. Simply put, I suppose we're stuck in a certain holding pattern with weather that's more at home in North Africa than it is up here, unable to find itself being pushed southwards as it normally would be by a jet stream coming over the top of it. Does that mean that this is going to happen next year and the year after, or perhaps just in a couple of years' time and then 2 years after that?
I think what you're going to see is more variability. It's quite clear that the climate is beginning to influence the jet stream. As it slows down, it gets lazier, and so you get these periods where you have either a prolonged warm spell or a prolonged cold spell, as you've seen in other parts of the world. And in a sense, what you've got is it's like a bit like a pendulum. And as the Earth warms, it's like putting more energy into a pendulum, so it swings more violently. So of course it comes back across the middle every time, but the extremes are further and further out.
One of the things that people notice, particularly in rural parts now, is that flowers are blossoming when they should be coming out in February, and trees aren't shedding with quite the confidence that they should, and they're starting to sort of look a bit healthier than they should in winter and so on. That is a real evidence of an upset, that it's hard to predict how we'd manage those kind of upsets, because we do rely on the seasons very much.
Well, if what we're seeing now is a cause of sort of quite early climate change, it's like a prelude to the full movie. We really don't want to experience the full thing. And that's what the scientists have been warning about, that we must stay below 2 degrees, because as we edge up towards 2, life becomes more and more unpleasant in the way that you described, more unpredictable. And so what scientists have advised governments is that going above 2 takes us into the area where the climate may become unmanageable. And I think that's partly why we saw such a pulling together of the world at the climate summit in Paris last week, because I think this is now getting to the point where politicians realize that the public is experiencing, as it were, the early onset of a changing climate.
If you think back to the first Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, the old Marshall Islands and Solomon Islands, these were the guys that was always pushed to the front to explain the dilemma, because they were seen as being on the front line, that the water levels rising would be our first indicator. But now, of course, we've probably got no end of volunteers coming forward saying our country also has started to experience strange weather patterns.
I think you're right about that. For a long time, it was thought of as a problem that was over there, somewhere far off, and not very thought about. And I think it is, as you say, beginning to get through now. This is a problem that affects everybody. That's why I think we saw such a coming together in Paris. Nobody escapes the consequences of a changing climate. Not everybody has conflict, not everybody has illness or ill health or poor education or bad government, but everybody deals with a changing climate.
Looking then at this Christmas for us, We can see now that we're all hovering, whether we're in Northern Ireland or Scotland or Wales, and we're getting more wet weather on the west side, but by and large we're hovering around 12 to 15 degrees. It would take that shift in the jet stream to push that Saharan weather south. Would that, if it happens, and do you think it will happen this year, or would it be quite sudden? Would it suddenly be we go to bed with 12 degrees and wake up with a fresh 5?
Well, to get a really good answer to that, you'd have to ask a meteorologist, and that's not what I do. But I think the sense is, can you get quite sudden changes? Yes, you can. Again, it's like a pendulum swing. If you put more energy into that pendulum swing, it swings faster. So the change that takes place is faster. But are we going to have a white Christmas anyway? I suspect
well, I
not.
don't think we're going to. And then briefly, Tom, we're nearly done. Just your idea of what sort of weather patterns might the UK have to get used to over the next 10 years? I guess wind and rain would be headlines on
Well,
that.
I think it depends where you are. So I think we've seen of the wind and the rain, but I also think part of the outcome of a changing climate is dry areas tend to get drier. So I think we might begin to see more periods, not of drought, but certainly of prolonged dry periods in the southeast of the country. We see very visibly this difference between different parts of the country.
Indeed. Tom Burke, thanks very much indeed for coming in. Pleasure talking to you.